Why don't you tell us what do you mean whenever you say miniature species?
All right, so I mean species that are like less than 8 inches long. So if it's smaller than, say, a leopard gecko, I call that a miniature species. So that's usually somewhere in the 6 inches and below department, 6 or 7 inches. Um, and the SVL is significantly smaller. So yeah, 3 to 4 inches SVL. Um, and smaller than crested gecko. So yeah, probably more like 3 inches SVL. It's like you can look at them and you're like, that's a miniature species, but that isn't. Like you don't call a crested gecko a miniature species. Even a small one.
You look
The
at like a Indo-Pacific tree gecko or something.
yeah.
You mean like
Yeah.
micro
So
geckos?
yep,
Hmm.
like micro geckos are a
Oh,
great
okay.
example of a miniature. So viper geckos, I would consider ocellated skinks also on the larger end of miniature species. Um, Morning geckos, obviously. Um, Electric blue geckos. The Williamsy, Lygodactylus williamsi, and a few others. So tiny, preferably like 2 inches SVL, really small, um, because they're great. You can, so one, they're fun, because these are not animals you can really handle because they're too small, they're too fast, um, and they're terrified of you because you are gigantic compared to them. So handling is not usually an option. And surprisingly, my viper geckos are fairly okay with me. And you see people like Frank Payne doing a pretty good job of handling his miniature species. He does just a wonderful job of acclimating them to him. He's this gentle giant to them, I guess. Maybe so far as their god. Frank's probably gonna get me for that, but um, what's amazing about miniature species to me is that they have so much potential as pets because yeah, we can't pet them and but you can still offer them treats with tongs. You can, and they're so fun to watch, especially because due to the limitations of the equipment available to us, it's very difficult to create a functional terrarium smaller than about 20 gallons. You get any smaller than that, I've pulled it off in 8 gallons, with bare minimum functionality, by my standards. Um, but any smaller than about 20 gallons, and you run into a lot of issues with being able to fit all of the equipment that you need on top of it. And the gradients will get thrown off, and it's just a nightmare to manage. So this forces you to give more space to a miniature species than you would to something larger. Um, for example, my viper geckos are kept in 24 by 18 by 18 Exoterra. And these are 4 inch long geckos, which means that the length of the enclosure is 6 times longer than the gecko itself, its total length. That would be like putting a bearded dragon, which is about, 2 feet long on average, in a 12-foot long enclosure. Think about that. An enclosure for a single bearded dragon that measures 12 feet by almost, let me do some math here. So 18 divided by 4 over the 4. So yeah, 12 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet. That is actually roughly the dimensions of the room that I'm standing in. It's a small bedroom for one bearded dragon. But that seems just unfathomable. If you're familiar with the Animals at Home podcast, he interviewed somebody who kept a leopard gecko like that. It's crazy.
I
It's
would love to do that.
insane,
I would
That's
love to
right?
do
awesome.
that.
It's this great idea. It's beyond zoo. It's something bigger. It's something I'd love to be able to do just to observe what happens when you put something like a bearded dragon into an environment that large by comparison. And yet I see my viper geckos in this enclosure, and granted there's three of them, so they're they are all sharing the same space, which makes it relatively smaller to each of them, right? But still, you look at one of them come in this gigantic enclosure relatively, And yet it's still so small compared to me. I am giving up so little of my space to provide them with so much relative to them. And then I know that, if I go down to southern Utah on a hike and I see a little Uda Uda lizard, a side blotched lizard, those lizards aren't much bigger, 4 or 5 inches, and they can traverse 12 feet in the matter of a minute, less. They are navigating these gigantic environments and using so much space. And then we have the gall to say that an enclosure is too big for an animal. There's no such thing as an enclosure that is too big. There's only an enclosure that is poorly set up. That's it. It is you don't have the resources, the know-how, or care enough to set it up properly. And it's my experience with keeping these smaller species that I have become so passionate about that has led me to changing my my guidelines for minimum enclosure size for lizards. I think because, get this, the enclosure size guidelines for a leopard gecko right now that people are advocating for from a lot of leopard gecko groups is 40 breeder is the bare minimum. 36 inches long by 18 inches by 18 inches. That is more than 3 times the length of that leopard gecko. So average leopard gecko is about 8 inches long. Yeah, that is, yeah, more than 4 times its length. And now there are people saying that that standard should be changed to 48 by 24, a 4 by 2 by 2, the same size that is still considered the minimum for a bearded dragon, which is a much larger, much more active 2-foot long lizard that we are still keeping in something that is only twice its length. So I've changed it on Reptiles, and I'm going to make a big push later when I have the time to write a blog post on this and dedicate the time to the campaign. I don't want to advocate a space any smaller than 3 times the length of a lizard. So for bearded dragons and blue-tongued skinks, that is that's going to be 6 feet by 2 feet minimum, preferably 6 by 3 by 3. More like 6 by 3. Sorry. Yeah, so preferably 6 by 3 by 3 or 6 by 3 for a blue-tongued skink would be optimal. But
Sorry.
basically, so if I can remember the math I did. So 6 square feet per foot of the animal's length, if it's terrestrial. Bearded dragons, it gets a little tricky because they spend a lot of time, especially males, up in trees. So arboreality kind of comes into account there, which means that I am being flexible right now about recommending it's either a 6 by 2 by 2 minimum for a bearded dragon or a 4 by 2 by 4, which is actually larger than a 6 by 2 by 2. It depends on whether you want to facilitate terrestrial space or arboreal space, preferably both. But I don't feel like I could get away with recommending 6 by 3 by 3 for a bearded dragon quite yet. Give it a few years, but right now I need people to adopt the idea that 4 by 2 by 2, which used to be considered unreasonable compared to the previous 75-gallon minimum.
It used to be the 40-gallon minimum.
Yeah, 50-gallon used to be the minimum, and then it got bumped to 75, and now we're at 120. And now, as we're learning more about these animals, as we're seeing more of their behaviors, as we're learning more about reptiles as a whole, it's just too small. I've kept bearded dragons in a 4 by one of them lived long enough to see a 4 by 2 by 2. And it worked for her because she was in palliative care. She was dying. And so it worked for her. She honestly spent most of her time on the warm side of a 4 by 2 by 2. So she used about 4 square feet total. Rarely left that area because she was critically ill. But once you see a miniature species, once you've kept a miniature species, and you see them using the full extent of that enclosure every single day, you realize that you need to change the way that you look at the larger species. And that is a tough fight. But that's the reason why I think everybody should keep a miniature, is just so that they can get a new perspective. I wouldn't recommend mourning geckos, though. They are a pain.
We had a really passionate and a very exciting conservation. See, here we go. Conversation with Mariah tonight. It was great to have you. And Mariah, I'm really looking forward to having you come back on, but thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.